Today, we're in our series on Paul's letter to the Ephesians, and we're going to pick up here today with part 2, where we left off last week. So we're working through the household codes in Ephesians 5, verse 21 through 6, verse 9. And part 1 is on the website if you missed it. And because last week's context is so critical for what we're going to talk about today, I'm going to take a few minutes just to review some of the high points so that we can understand where we're at this morning. And then you can go back if you have some questions about this passage to the previous message if you didn't make it. You'll remember from last week that this passage that we talked about is broken into 3 parts: the relationship between wives and husbands, children and fathers, and slaves and masters. Our Bibles have headings that are not original to the text, subject headings. And some of these headings make it appear as though these are 3 separate passages that don't really interconnect with each other. However, I suggest that isolating these verses out of context has caused much harm. Wives, submit to your husbands has been wielded with heavy hand at times to silence a woman's voice and suppress her abilities and her value. Slaves, obey your masters has been used to justify the horrors of the slave trade. Last week we discussed how these must be read in context in order to grasp the original intent of Paul's words. Paul's first hearers would have recognized the structure of this household code right away. 600 years earlier, Aristotle wrote to the husband, he wrote to the father and to the master, but instructing him how to dominate over his wife, his sons, and his slaves. For Aristotle, the male head of the household was superior by nature. Women, children, and slaves were considered property and had little rights or value. And so by the first century, Aristotle's patriarchal views were built into Roman law and culture. It's with this backdrop that Paul's household code makes a profound political statement. Messiah's communities are not in compliance with the Roman way. Instead, Paul is writing profound verses of freedom and equality for women and children and slaves, the most vulnerable of Roman society. Last week we saw that when we take this passage as a whole, Paul bookends his household code with something radical. Submit yourselves to one another out of reverence for Messiah. Then he speaks about husbands and wives, wives and husbands, children and fathers, and slaves and masters. And then in verse 6-9, he closes the section with, there is no favoritism in Messiah. So everything that Paul writes in between must be framed with this message. Submit yourselves to one another because there is no favoritism in Messiah. Last week, we worked our way through the text in reverse order. We began with slaves and masters to understand how he's closing first, and then we moved to children and fathers. The big takeaways from those 2 sections is that Paul reverses the most power-driven relationship possible, the master and the slave. While Aristotle instructed a master how to rule his slaves, Paul wrote to the slaves themselves. Unheard of. For Paul, if slaves are to obey their masters as if serving the Lord, then masters must also obey their slaves, he says, as if serving the Lord. Paul undercuts the institution of slavery for believers in Yeshua at the core. Children and fathers. Remember, Romulus gave greater power to the father over his son than to the master over his slave. So Paul speaks directly to the child. Rather than obey his father because of his father's strength as a patriarch, a child is to honor his father because of the blessings and promise in the Torah. And fathers are not to rule over their children, but they're to not provoke them to anger, but bring them up in the instruction of the Lord. Paul's radical message is that Messiah has set the most vulnerable free and challenged those who are in authority to the love and the sacrificial life of Messiah, bringing this into our homes. So with this backdrop, let's take a look at what Paul says about wives and husbands. So verse 21 again, also submit yourselves to one another out of reverence for Messiah. Wives, to your own husbands as to the Lord. We'll pause there for a moment. First, some translations, like the King James translation, the English Standard Version, the New American Standard, they place a subject heading called marriage, and they place it between verse 21 and 22. The editorial choice reflects how translators wanted to read this passage, where verse 21 and 22 are separated, and 21 connects to the sentence before, the passage before, and then 22 below. Does that make sense? NIV, the TLV, and others, they say no, and they connect verse 21 with 22. I think this makes the most sense because the early manuscripts don't actually say in verse 22, wives, submit to your husbands. In the Greek, there's no verb in 522. It simply says, wives, to your husbands. So the verb of the preceding verse is carried over from 21, which reads, submit yourselves to one another out of reverence for Messiah. Verse 22, wives, to your husbands. So implicit in this verse is that husbands also in some way must submit to their wives in this verse. So why did Paul begin with the wife? It wasn't to emphasize her submission over the husbands. It was to challenge Roman patriarchy. Male authority over women was built into Roman law. Wives legally had to submit to the authority of their husbands. Unmarried women had to submit to the authority of their fathers and nearest male relatives. Women could not own property or run a business or conduct legal or financial matters. And like we've seen for masters and father, Aristotle spoke to the man only about how the husband should rule over his wife like the slave and the child. The wife is ignored entirely. Paul makes a radical statement for the Ephesians that they would have picked up on. He speaks to her first. Paul gives her a new voice. He gives her value in the homes and communities of Messiah. If he was just reiterating Roman patriarchy, it would have been nothing new. But he says you should live differently. We're looking for something new. What is he saying? And if we look at this entire section, Paul speaks to the wife first, then to the child first, and then to the slave first. And he progressively gets more and more radical as he validates the more vulnerable of society, while also calling the strong to a life of sacrificial love of Yeshua himself. Now, this is interesting. The Greek word that we translate to submit is hupatasso. Generally, in the Brit Chadashah, this word does not carry the weight of obedience like someone who would submit to a king, but more to adapt oneself to one another in love, or to give of oneself for the sake of others. In a midrashic way, the Hebrew root that best corresponds with the Greek root here, kaf nun ayin, carries the meaning of humble. And just like in English, words can have double meanings. One can be forced to submit, or one can choose to submit out of humility and love. And here, hupatasso means a voluntary submission of humbling oneself by adapting oneself to one another in love. The entire context of this chapter requires this. Paul introduces this section in 5:1 by saying, therefore, be imitators of God as dearly loved children and walk in love, just as Messiah also loved us and gave himself for us as an offering and a sacrifice to God for a fragrant aroma. This is Paul's big point in this section. All of our relationships are to be characterized by this humble submission and love. And the rest of this passage is commentary on how this new sacrificial life in Messiah works out in different ways in these close relationships at home. Let's go on to the next verse. For the husband is head of the wife, as Messiah also is head of his community, himself the Savior of the body. But the Messiah's community is submitted to Messiah, so also wives to their husbands in everything. Here's where this passage becomes quite nuanced. Paul frames the way that a wife and a husband might adapt to one another in love differently. Now, I don't see these as like universal commandments or like a marriage training course. I think every marriage needs to work these out in different ways. Paul's not telling us who should mow the lawn, handle the money, or take care of the kids, or how decisions are to be made in marriage necessarily. We can draw from this, but that's not the point of this passage. This passage is really about Messiah's communities standing apart from the Roman system. That said, I think there is tremendous value for us in these distinctions. In the midst of this message of equality and radical mutual sacrifice, Paul articulates timeless truths that can bring peace and order and love to a marriage and a home. The Greek word kaphale is literally physically a head. That's what it means, a head, just like my head. The head and the body image is beautiful in marriage. Paul alludes to the Torah's vision for marriage. The man shall be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. In marriage, a husband and a wife are so joined together that they are one body. The two are joined together in a way that works seamlessly together to serve God's purposes in the world. If we read more into the imagery, head doesn't mean ruler, like Rome. Perhaps Paul's picking up on some of the differences he sees between men and women. This is true of my marriage at least. Raina is able to micromanage dozens of things at once. She can problem solve and remember all kinds of tasks to keep our family running. And my tendency is to be in the clouds, looking out over the horizon to see how God's greater truths might play out in the purposes of our home. So my role in our marriage is to see the forest over the trees, and I rely on Raina to make sure that we don't just stumble over the roots. Nestled within these verses is the responsibility of the husband to bear the primary weight for the health and success of the marriage. A weak man, or as C.S. Lewis says, a man without a chest, blames his wife for the failures in marriage. A husband must take ownership and take initiation to solve problems, to make things right. A husband who wants to be the head must say, "I'm sorry" first when he feels self-justified. He must lead his family in devotions, in prayer, and into deeper spiritual life. Most women are quite capable of doing this. Most women are very willing to step up when a husband isn't willing or isn't able. And that isn't necessarily wrong. But something within a man dies when he doesn't stand and fight for his home, when he doesn't pursue his beloved's deepest happiness and lead his family into the love and life of Messiah. I've heard this passage interpreted this way: husbands, be responsible. Wives, allow your husbands to take responsibility. I wonder if Paul recognizes this and he calls on the wife to love her husband by helping him take on this responsibility that will embolden him to step into his purpose and mission in the world. Now I digress into the realm of marriage books and seminars for another time. Let's go to the next slide. Aristotle instructed husbands how to rule over their wives like a master rules over his slave. This was law. Paul made a loud and unexpected statement right at the beginning. No, you must submit yourselves to one another. And then he goes on to elaborate, yes, wives to your husbands, but also husbands to your wives with complete abandon and total self-sacrifice. Verse 25, husbands, love your wives, just as Messiah also loved his community and gave himself up for her to make her holy, having cleansed her by immersion in the word. Messiah did this so that he might present himself, his glorious community, not having stain or wrinkle or any such thing, but in order that she might be holy and blameless. Husbands, when was the last time you washed your wife's feet? That's how Messiah loved his community. I don't think it was just a metaphor. Yeshua led by serving. He submitted himself to death for our own sake, dying for us. Paul is saying, husbands, don't rule over your wives. Husbands, die for them. I love this story of a speaker who stood up about this passage and said, I will die for my wife. And his wife was in the back, and she shouted back, if only you'd pick up your socks. Many husbands would literally die for their wives if the time warranted. That's right. But I think more often, Paul is really calling husbands to die to our own self in marriage. Those thousands of tiny deaths every day, like picking up socks, like taking the hit, like saying, I'm sorry. Paul is saying, men, don't allow your anger to make you seem like a tyrant in your home. Don't blame your wife for life's problems. Take ownership of your marriage and come alongside and support your wife to find godly solutions. Take initiative for the spiritual health and the trajectory of your home, to lead in seeking the Lord and cultivating an atmosphere in the home where your wife can flourish. If you will die for your wife, will you live for her? This is a high calling in marriage. It's our job to create an atmosphere where our wives might not have stain or wrinkle or any such thing, but in order that she might be holy and blameless. Wow. Now, I doubt that any of us guys here will ever be able to come close. Maybe some of you guys do this well already, but I struggle with this ideal. But it's worth the question. If you're a married man, does your wife feel more and more loved as the years go by? Do you wake up and think of how you can meet her needs instead of meeting your own needs? I wonder if one of the things that Paul picked up on here is that we men can be pretty self-centered by nature. Would you guys agree? I don't know, maybe it's just me. I need this radical message of self-sacrifice to learn how to be a husband, to learn how to better love Raina and not crumble under the pressures and needs of marriage and family life that come along with it. Getting back to the text, Paul's household codes demanded that the husband do exactly the opposite of what Roman law allowed. He must sacrifice his life for his wife instead of exercising his power over her. His next verses are even more countercultural. Verse 28, in the same way, husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Messiah also does his community, because we are members of his body. Now, in context, this totally undercuts Roman culture. We know from other ancient Greco-Roman household codes that a woman's body was actually considered inferior to a man's body. A man's body was glorified, while a woman's body was considered impure. In his Generation of Animals, Aristotle wrote this, and I'm quoting, it's horrible, but I'm quoting it anyway. The female is as if it were a deformed male, and that because females are weaker and colder in their nature, we should look upon the female state as being as if it were a deformity. I don't know what he was thinking. He must have been a very frustrated and confused guy. But even Jewish philosopher Philo in the first century always portrayed the male as superior to the female. He felt that masculinity was, in his words, closer to divinity than femininity is. I think these guys got it backwards. It seems like such a horrible thing now, but for these Ephesians that Paul's writing to, that was their assumption. Women were seen more as property rather than treasured daughter of God in Messiah. And Paul comes in and Paul says, no, husbands, love your wife's body as your own body. He who loves his wife loves himself. In fact, love her so that you can present her as pure and holy, without blemish. She is holy and sacred, beloved, and beautiful. It's a totally different message. And I actually think that in God's hierarchy, God's creation moves from more simple to more beautiful and complex. So God made women last, the crown of creation. And Paul instructs husbands to serve their wives and to create an atmosphere where their wives can become everything they will become in the kingdom of heaven. He ties it all together. Verse 31, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is great, but I'm talking about Messiah and his community. In any case, let each of you love his own wife as himself, and let the wife respect her husband. Now, like we saw earlier, with the body and the head, Paul recognizes that a husband and a wife are a team, literally one body with different parts. There's a marriage book that Raina and I like called Love and Respect that draws off of verse 33. And the big message is that men and women have slightly different ways that we each need to express and receive mutual sacrificial love for each other. Psychologists say that some women's deepest desires are to feel protected, desired, and cared for. She might need her husband to pursue her and to treat her as the most beautiful woman in the world to him in order to feel seen and to feel valued, to feel love. A husband, however, might feel love from his wife more in the form of respect. He needs to feel that his wife admires him, praises him with affirmation, and treat him as though he is a respected elder at the gate. Of course, men need love. Women also need respect. But love and respect might carry a different weight that reflects these deeper needs that men and women have. When crisis strikes in a marriage, I'll tell you, this cycle is often the problem, or part of the problem. Life becomes difficult and wears a couple down. A man stops pursuing his wife as he might have done in years past. She doesn't feel loved by her husband because he doesn't step up and initiate by listening to her, cherishing her, valuing her, serving her, romancing her. Reacting in hurt, a wife might become critical of her husband. She tries to draw him back by complaining about his failures. She stops admiring him and giving him respect. And that's like a knife in his already wounded back. And that husband will then pull back and retreat even further, also no longer feeling loved by his wife. And it doesn't matter who started it. It becomes this vicious cycle. And the husband and wife grow more and more and more distant until one day the love is gone and they can't be around each other without erupting in volcanoes of hurt. It only takes one in a marriage to truly step out of the cycle, to let the hurts go, and to choose to love your spouse the way he or she needs. I love a phrase that Rabbi Rich uses: love to lose and lose to love. Love to lose and lose to love. For Paul, marriage is not about happiness. Marriage is about holiness. And holiness means that God is using your marriage, no matter how bad it is, no matter how great it is, He's using your marriage to help you grow and to become more like Messiah, giving of yourself in love. And let's go back to the big picture here to close. More than marriage advice, Paul is trying to use the way that marriage is supposed to be to teach us about community life within the Messiah. A marriage reflects this mysterious union, he says, of Messiah and his community. Submit to one another in love. A slave to his master as serving the Lord. A child to his father in the blessings of the Torah. A wife in admiration for her husband as she might look to Messiah, her true Lord. And a master in kindness and freedom for his slave, a father in gentleness and investment in a child, and a husband as he might give of himself in total sacrifice and abandon for his wife, modeled by Messiah himself. It goes beyond marriage. It goes beyond children. It goes beyond the master and the servant. Paul's big point is that for everyone, you need to live differently than those around you. Messiah has set the most vulnerable free and challenged those in authority to follow the love and sacrificial life of Messiah into the altar of our homes and into our communities. In Messiah, we are to live other-focused lives of service with a tilt towards submission to one another as though we were submitting to Messiah himself. A new life where we defer to one another in love and we serve in the areas that God has called us to, beginning with those in our most intimate parts of life, our homes, and extending out with gentleness and with patience, thanksgiving, and joy. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you. And I'm going to invite Evan up.